His name is Ellsworth Wearim. He is a cardiac surgeon. At 95 years old, he is still scrubbing in for open-heart surgery at Loma Linda University Medical Center, still standing at the operating table for hours at a time, still making the decisions that determine whether a patient's heart keeps beating. His colleagues are in their 40s and 50s. Some of them are already developing the chronic conditions their patients come to them with: high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, early metabolic dysfunction. Ellsworth Wearim has none of these. His cardiovascular markers at 95 are cleaner than most of the residents 20 years his junior. He lives alone in a house he maintains himself. He does his own gardening. He drives himself to work. He eats no meat. He has not eaten meat for decades. He eats nuts every day. He eats legumes at every meal. He eats whole grains prepared simply without much modification from the way they grew in the ground. He drinks water. He does not smoke. He goes to church on Saturday. He will live to 104. Here is what makes this more than one man's exceptional genetics. Loma Linda, California is a small city in San Bernardino County, one of the most medically troubled regions in the United States. The county has some of the highest rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in California. The air quality is poor. The food environment is dominated by fast food chains. The social conditions are not favorable to longevity by any measure. And yet, inside this same county, surrounded by the same air and the same food landscape, a community of Seventh-day Adventists lives 10 to 12 years longer than the average American. Men in this community reach 90 at rates that researchers have documented as among the highest in the Western world. Loma Linda is the only blue zone in the United States. The only one. In a country of 330 million people, this one community of approximately 9,000 Adventists produces longevity outcomes that no other American population has replicated. The same environment, the same country, the same county, in fact. Completely different biological outcomes. Scientists wanted to know why. The Adventist Health Studies, two massive longitudinal research projects tracking first 30,000 and then 96,000 Adventists over decades, produced one of the most detailed dietary longevity datasets in scientific history. The researchers were not looking for a single magic food. They were looking for patterns. And what they found, after years of analysis, was consistent enough to be remarkable. I am going to show you the 3 dietary practices that consistently appeared across every longevity outcome the Adventist data documented. And at the end of this video, I am going to tell you something about where Loma Linda sits geographically, and why that makes the data even more extraordinary than it looks at first glance. Stay until the end, because the geographic piece changes how you interpret everything. But first, what most people assume about Adventist longevity that the data does not support. The assumption is that Adventists live longer because they do not drink alcohol and do not smoke. Both are true. Adventists abstain from alcohol and tobacco as part of their religious practice. But when the Adventist Health Study, 2 researchers controlled for these variables, comparing non-drinking, non-smoking Adventists to non-drinking, non-smoking non-Adventists, the longevity gap remained significant. Something beyond the absence of alcohol and tobacco was driving the outcome. And that something was consistently, persistently, unmistakably the food. Tier 1. Walnuts. The Adventist Health Study 1, tracking 30,000 participants, produced a finding so consistent that researchers described it as one of the most robust dietary longevity associations they had ever documented. People who ate nuts 5 or more times per week lived on average 2 years longer than those who rarely or never ate them. Not 2% longer. 2 years. An entire additional 2 years of life from a dietary habit that costs under $1 a day and requires zero preparation beyond opening a bag. The mechanism is not simple. Walnuts are the most thoroughly studied nut in the longevity literature, and the data points at several simultaneous pathways. The alpha-linolenic acid in walnuts, a plant-based omega-3 precursor, reduces inflammatory cytokine production over time. The ellagic acid and ellagitannins are converted by gut bacteria into urolithins, compounds that a 2022 study in Nature Aging linked to mitochondrial recycling and improved muscle function in older adults. The arginine in walnuts directly supports nitric oxide production, maintaining arterial elasticity and reducing the endothelial damage that initiates cardiovascular plaque formation. None of this requires a supplement. None of it requires a prescription. It requires 30 grams of walnuts, roughly a handful, consumed regularly enough that the mechanisms operate continuously rather than periodically. The Adventists in Loma Linda were not taking omega-3 capsules or nitric oxide supplements. They were eating nuts with their lunch because their mothers had done the same. Tier 2. Legumes. If the walnut finding was robust, the legume finding was categorical. Across the Adventist Health Study, 2 data, 96,000 participants, 7 years of follow-up, legume consumption 4 or more times per week was the single dietary factor most consistently associated with reduced all-cause mortality across the entire cohort. Not the most significant factor among plant foods, the most significant factor across everything they measured, including exercise frequency, including body weight, including family history. Beans, lentils, chickpeas, and peas appeared at the Adventist table in forms that reflected the diversity of the community. Black bean soups, lentil stews, hummus, split pea dishes. But the consistency of consumption was the constant. 4 times a week as a floor, not a ceiling. The mechanism runs through the gut in ways that researchers are only now beginning to fully map. Resistant starch from legumes reaches the colon intact and feeds Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and Rosaburia intestinalis, 2 bacterial species that produce butyrate in quantities that maintain the structural integrity of the gut barrier. When that barrier holds, bacterial endotoxins stay contained. When it fails, lipopolysaccharides enter circulation and trigger the chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that precedes virtually every major age-related disease by 10 to 15 years. The Adventists were not managing inflammation with anti-inflammatory drugs. They were maintaining the gut ecosystem that prevented inflammatory cascades from initiating in the first place. Before Tier 3, if this is useful, subscribe to Longevity Code. Every week, we decode 1 blue zone, 1 population, 1 system. Always peer-reviewed, always practical, always something specific you can start this week. Tier 3. Whole grains. The Adventist dietary pattern centers on whole grains prepared simply. Oats for breakfast, whole wheat bread, brown rice, barley in soups. Not refined grain products marketed as healthy, but structurally identical to white flour. Actual whole grains in which the bran, germ, and endosperm remain intact. The distinction matters biologically. The bran layer of a grain contains the majority of the fiber and phytochemicals. The germ contains the vitamin E, B vitamins, and essential fatty acids. The endosperm, the part that remains after refining, is almost entirely starch. When you consume a refined grain product, You are consuming the fraction of the grain that produces the highest glycemic response with the lowest nutritional return. A 2016 meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal, pooling data from 45 studies covering nearly 1 million participants, found that 3 servings of whole grains daily was associated with a 22% reduction in cardiovascular mortality and a 15% reduction in all-cause mortality. The Adventist data confirmed this pattern consistently. Whole grain consumers in the cohort showed lower fasting glucose, lower inflammatory markers, and better preservation of lean body mass into older age compared to refined grain consumers in the same community. Ellsworth Wearim ate oatmeal for breakfast every morning of his adult life. Not instant oats, not flavored packets. Rolled oats cooked in water with fruit. Simple, cheap, and consistently present at his table for over 60 years. What does this look like in practice? In the first 7 days, replacing a refined grain breakfast with whole oats alongside a handful of walnuts costs under $2 per meal and begins shifting the gut microbiome toward the butyrate-producing populations that the legume tier will then sustain. The glycemic stability from whole oats versus refined grain products is measurable within days. In fasting glucose readings, a flatter morning glucose curve means lower cortisol reactivity and steadier energy through the morning. Within 30 days, consistent legume consumption 4 times per week begins the microbiome restructuring documented in the Cell 2021 Dietary shift studies. The gut ecosystem does not change overnight. It shifts gradually as the bacterial populations that thrive on resistant starch expand and those dependent on refined carbohydrates contract. The change is slow and cumulative. After 30 years of consistent eating, it is profound. Within 90 days, the combination of walnut-derived omega-3 precursors, legume-derived butyrate production, and whole grain fiber creates a measurably different inflammatory baseline. The Adventist Health Study participants who showed the most dramatic longevity outcomes were not people who had recently adopted these practices. They were people who had eaten this way their entire adult lives, because it was how their community ate, not because they had read a study about it. Now, the geography. Loma Linda sits in the San Bernardino Valley, east of Los Angeles, in a region with some of the worst air quality in the United States. The particulate matter from vehicle traffic and industrial sources in this valley has been linked to elevated cardiovascular and respiratory disease rates across the broader population. The food environment surrounding Loma Linda is a standard American suburban landscape. Fast food chains, convenience stores, processed food at every corner. The 9,000 Adventists in Loma Linda are breathing the same air as their neighbors. They are driving the same roads. Their children attend the same schools. In every environmental variable that researchers can measure, air quality, water quality, access to healthcare, economic conditions, Loma Linda Adventists are not advantaged compared to the surrounding population, and they live 10 to 12 years longer. The researchers who have spent decades studying this community consistently arrive at the same conclusion. The longevity advantage is not environmental. It is dietary and behavioral. It is produced by specific eating patterns maintained consistently across a lifetime within a community that reinforces those patterns socially and spiritually. The same walnuts, the same beans, the same oats, eaten with the same consistency, in the same social context, for generation after generation. Ellsworth Wearim did not discover optimal longevity nutrition through research. He inherited it. He ate what his parents ate, in a community where everyone ate that way, for 104 years. The biology simply reflected what the food delivered consistently, without interruption, across an entire life. What is the one food from this list, walnuts, legumes, or whole grains, that you eat least consistently right now? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to Longevity Code. Next week, another blue zone, another centenarian, another system. Always the science, always something you can start this week.